The smell of burnt motor oil and rust still clung to the air the morning Sarah Chen signed the paperwork that made her the owner of a business everyone in town had already written off as dead. Her hands didn't shake as she wrote her name across the bottom of the sales agreement, though they probably should have. She was betting the last $900 she had to her name, her 8-year-old daughter's stability, and what remained of her dignity on a gutted auto shop in a town that barely remembered her father and didn't care to remember her at all. The previous owner, a hollow-eyed man named Frank Delaney, had looked at her like she was signing her own death warrant. But Sarah had seen worse things than failing businesses. She'd seen eviction notices taped to apartment doors while her daughter slept inside. She'd seen her savings account hit zero while bills piled up like accusations. She'd seen the look in her ex-husband's eyes when he'd made it clear that supporting his own child was optional, not obligatory. A crumbling auto shop in the industrial zone of Grafton, Pennsylvania, wasn't a dream. It was the only option left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The building itself looked like it had given up years before Frank finally did. Chain-link fence sagged around a gravel lot, littered with rusted parts and oil drums that had been sitting so long they'd become part of the landscape. The main garage had 3 bays, but only one door still opened properly. The others were jammed halfway down, frozen in a permanent state of surrender. Windows that once displayed proud signage for Delaney's automotive service now showed nothing but grime and the ghosts of peeling letters. The office attached to the front of the building had water damage staining the ceiling tiles, and the linoleum floor was cracked in patterns that looked like dried riverbeds. This was what $900 bought you when you had nothing else to spend. But Sarah had learned something during her 6 years as a fleet maintenance supervisor before the company had dissolved in bankruptcy proceedings. She'd learned that most people looked at machines and saw problems. She looked at them and saw solutions waiting to be discovered. Her daughter Emma sat in the passenger seat of their 15-year-old Honda Civic, watching her mother with the kind of careful attention that children develop when they've learned to read adult emotions for signs of danger. At 8 years old, Emma had already lived through her parents' divorce, 3 different apartments, her mother's layoff, and a month sleeping on her aunt's couch because they had nowhere else to go. She'd learned not to complain, not to ask for things, and not to believe in promises about how things were going to get better. "Is this our new house?" Emma asked, though the question carried more resignation than hope. "It's our new business," Sarah corrected, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "There's an apartment upstairs. It needs work, but it's ours." What she didn't say was that the apartment had no heat, half the windows were broken, and the previous tenant had apparently been using it as storage for parts that were now scattered across every surface like mechanical debris after a storm. What she didn't say was that she had no plan beyond surviving the next week, no backup if this desperate gamble failed, and no idea whether a woman with maintenance experience but no business license, no capital, and no connections could actually make a failing auto shop profitable. Frank Delaney had been almost apologetic when he'd handed over the keys, a ring of rusted metal that felt heavier than it should have. "Place has history," he'd muttered, not quite meeting her eyes. "Been in my family since my grandfather opened it in 1947. He did good work. Honest work." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah pause, some weight to the words that suggested he was talking about more than just oil changes and brake jobs. "Why are you selling?" she'd asked, though she'd already heard the rumors. Business dried up, couldn't compete with the chain shops out by the highway, health problems. The usual story of small operations that couldn't adapt to a world that had moved on without them. But Frank's answer had been different than she'd expected. "Some places hold on to things," he'd said quietly, his eyes finally meeting hers with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to a simple business transaction. Sometimes what they're holding onto is worth more than what you can see on the surface, and sometimes what they're holding onto is dangerous if you don't know how to handle it properly. He'd left before she could ask what he meant, climbing into his truck with the careful movements of a man much older than his 63 years, leaving her standing in the gravel lot with a key ring and a feeling that there was something about this transaction he hadn't told her. The first week was about survival and assessment. Sarah spent her days scrubbing decades of grime from surfaces that hadn't seen cleaning supplies in years, while Emma helped by organizing the scattered tools and parts into some semblance of order. The apartment upstairs slowly transformed from uninhabitable storage space into something that could charitably be called living quarters. She'd found a used space heater at a yard sale for $20, patched the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape, and created a bedroom for Emma in what had once been the office manager's break room. It wasn't much. The floor still sloped at an angle that suggested foundation problems, the bathroom sink leaked constantly, and the kitchen consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge she'd bought at a pawn shop. But it was theirs. No landlord to answer to. No rent due on the 15th of every month. No threat of eviction if she couldn't scrape together enough money to keep a roof over Emma's head. For the first time in 8 months, Sarah went to sleep without calculating how many days they had until homelessness. But it was the garage itself that consumed most of her attention, both because it represented their potential future income and because the more she explored the building, the more she realized that Frank's cryptic warning might have been more than paranoid rambling. The layout didn't make sense. The main garage was large enough for 3 full-size vehicles, with room for tool chests and equipment storage, but the interior dimensions seemed smaller than the exterior walls should have allowed. She'd noticed it the first day, but had dismissed it as architectural quirks from decades of modifications and additions. But as she measured the space while planning where to position equipment, the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. The east wall of the garage, the one that backed up against the neighboring property, was at least 8 feet thicker than it should have been. She'd initially assumed it was just heavy brick construction or additional insulation, but that didn't explain why there were electrical conduits running into the wall that didn't connect to any visible outlets or equipment on the garage side. Nor did it explain the faint ventilation hum she could sometimes hear late at night when the building was quiet, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere behind that wall. Emma had been the one to find the first real clue, mostly because children were smaller and more willing to crawl into spaces that adults dismissed as inaccessible. "Mom, there's a door back here." She'd called from behind a massive steel shelving unit that Sarah had been planning to move once she had help and proper equipment. Sarah had squeezed into the narrow gap between the shelving and the wall, expecting to find an old closet or utility access that had been blocked off decades ago. Instead, she found herself looking at a heavy metal door, painted the same industrial grey as the walls, with a keyhole that looked far too modern for a building that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. "Don't touch it," Sarah said instinctively, though Emma had already backed away from the door with the cautious respect that children develop for things that feel forbidden. The door was locked, and none of the keys on Frank's ring fit the mechanism, but more concerning than the lock was the door itself. This wasn't standard commercial construction. The door was reinforced steel, the kind used for secure storage or vault access, and the frame was anchored into the wall with industrial bolts that suggested whatever was behind it was meant to stay hidden and protected. Sarah spent the next 2 days trying to rationalize the discovery. Maybe it was an old safe room from when the neighborhood had been rougher. Maybe it was just storage for expensive equipment that Frank's grandfather had wanted to protect. Maybe it was nothing more than a quirk of old construction, a vestige from when buildings were designed with spaces that modern people found unnecessary. But the rationalization fell apart when she found the electrical panel in the basement, a space she'd been avoiding because of the water damage and the smell of mold that suggested serious foundation problems. The panel itself was massive, far larger than necessary for a building this size, and it had two separate sections. One section controlled the normal building systems, garage lights, office power, the ancient HVAC system that probably hadn't worked properly in years. But the second section was labeled with codes that meant nothing to her. Subsystem Delta, ventilation, secondary, security override, environmental control. These weren't labels for an auto shop. They were labels for something else entirely, something that required backup power, dedicated ventilation, and security systems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The decision to investigate further wasn't really a decision at all. It was an inevitability driven by the same desperation that had brought her to this failing auto shop in the first place. Sarah had nothing to lose except a business that was already failing and a future that was already uncertain. If there was something valuable behind that wall, something that Frank Delaney had been too afraid or too ethical to exploit, then she needed to know about it. Not because she was greedy, but because she had an 8-year-old daughter sleeping in a converted break room and less than $300 left to her name. Whatever secrets this building held, they couldn't be worse than the reality she was already facing. She waited until Emma was asleep, exhausted from a day of helping clean and organize, before returning to the hidden door. She'd bought a battery-powered angle grinder from a pawn shop for $40, money she couldn't afford to spend, but couldn't afford not to spend if she was serious about getting through that door. The noise would be substantial, but the nearest occupied building was 3 blocks away, and the industrial zone was essentially deserted after dark. The lock gave way after 20 minutes of careful cutting, the reinforced mechanism finally surrendering to a tool it had never been designed to resist. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing not a storage closet or an old safe, but a descending staircase made of poured concrete, lit by emergency lighting that activated automatically when the door opened. Sarah stood at the top of those stairs for a long moment, feeling the cool air rising from below, air that carried the faint scent of electronics and something else she couldn't quite identify. This wasn't an abandoned space. The air was too fresh, the lights too functional, the stairs too clean. Whatever was down there, someone had been maintaining it. The question was, who and why, and what it meant that she now owned the property that concealed it. She descended the stairs slowly, her phone's flashlight adding to the emergency lighting, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from mundane to impossible. Each step took her deeper into a mystery that Frank Delaney had tried to warn her about without quite having the courage to explain directly. And with each step, Sarah Chen moved further from being a desperate single mother who'd made a questionable business investment and closer to becoming something else entirely. The unwitting guardian of secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in an anteroom roughly 10 feet square, with walls made of reinforced concrete and a second door, this one with a keypad lock that glowed with the standby light of active electronics. Above the keypad, stenciled in faded military-style lettering, were words that made her breath catch. Defense Intelligence Communications Facility, Project Cerberus, authorized personnel only. Security clearance required. Sarah stood frozen, staring at those words, understanding that her $900 purchase had just become infinitely more complicated than a failed auto shop with foundation problems. She'd bought a building with a government facility hidden beneath it, a facility that was apparently still active decades after it should have been decommissioned and forgotten. The question that dominated her thoughts wasn't whether to proceed. It was what would happen when whoever was maintaining this facility discovered that the property above it had changed hands, and whether a single mother with no legal resources, no political connections, and no idea what she'd stumbled into would survive long enough to protect her daughter from the consequences of a discovery that was already far beyond anything she'd imagined possible. The keypad blinked steadily in the dim light, waiting for a code she didn't have, protecting secrets she hadn't asked to find. standing between her and answers that would either save her family or destroy everything she'd sacrificed to build. Behind her, the stairs led back to the mundane reality of a failing auto shop and a sleeping child who trusted her mother to make decisions that would keep them safe. Ahead of her, the locked door promised revelations that could change everything about their desperate situation if she had the courage to continue discovering what Frank Delaney's family had been protecting for the past 77 years. Sarah Chen made her choice the same way she'd made every choice since her divorce, since her layoff, since the eviction notice and the desperate scramble to survive. She chose to move forward, because going back meant accepting a future that offered nothing except poverty and defeat. Her fingers reached for the keypad, not yet knowing what code to try, but absolutely certain that whatever lay beyond that door was worth the risk of finding out. The keypad accepted a code she never should have been able to guess, 4 digits that she'd found, scratched into the underside of Frank Delaney's workbench when she'd been moving equipment. 1947. The year his grandfather had opened the auto shop. The year, she now understood, that something else had been hidden beneath it. The door opened with a pneumatic hiss that suggested seals designed to keep air quality controlled. And Sarah found herself stepping into a corridor that belonged in a completely different world than the one she'd left 20 feet above. Fluorescent lights activated in sequence as she moved forward, illuminating walls lined with communication equipment, filing cabinets with classification labels still visible despite decades of age, and warning signs about authorized access and security protocols. This wasn't an abandoned relic. Every surface was clean. The air filtration system hummed with active operation. Temperature controls maintained a steady 68 degrees. Wherever this facility led, whatever purpose it had once served, someone had been keeping it functional long after the Cold War. Paranoia that had created it should have rendered it obsolete. The main chamber opened before her like a museum to secrets that were never meant to be preserved. The room was roughly 40 feet square, with a ceiling that rose to accommodate equipment racks filled with communication devices, early computer systems, and data storage that represented technology from multiple decades. Some equipment looked original to the facility's construction, massive vacuum tube systems and mechanical switches that belonged in the 1940s. Other components were clearly more recent additions. Digital displays from the 80s, computer terminals from the 90s, even what appeared to be modern fiber optic connections installed within the last few years. Someone had been upgrading this facility continuously, maintaining its capacity to function even as the world above forgot it existed. Along the east wall, filing cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling, each drawer labeled with codes and dates that spanned from 1947 to classifications so recent they made Sarah's hands shake as she read them. Project Cerberus, the stenciling had said. But these labels suggested something far more comprehensive than a single operation. Domestic surveillance protocols, asset protection contingencies, population control methodologies, economic manipulation frameworks, political compromise, documentation. Sarah opened the nearest drawer with hands that had stopped trembling because she'd moved beyond fear into a kind of cold clarity that came from understanding that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Inside were files, thousands of pages organized with bureaucratic precision, documenting surveillance operations conducted against American citizens during the 1950s. Not foreign spies or enemy agents, but labor organizers, civil rights activists, journalists who'd written articles critical of government policy, and politicians who'd opposed programs that this facility had been designed to protect. Each file contained photographs, intercepted communications, financial records, and detailed notes about vulnerabilities that could be exploited for blackmail or manipulation. These weren't historical documents preserved for academic interest. They were operational files, maintained and updated with notations that continued into the present decade, suggesting that whatever surveillance this facility had conducted 70 years ago, it had never actually stopped. The next drawer contained financial records that traced money flows through accounts and shell corporations designed to fund operations without congressional oversight or public accountability. Millions of dollars moving through systems that existed in the gaps between legitimate government budgets and the black operations that no elected official would ever admit authorizing. The paper trail showed payments to informants, bribes to foreign officials, funding for covert actions that ranged from propaganda campaigns to political assassinations. But it was the third drawer that made Sarah understand why Frank Delaney had looked at her with such haunted desperation when he'd handed over the keys. The files here were labeled with names she recognized, current politicians and business leaders whose public images bore no resemblance to the compromised individuals documented in these pages. Senators with hidden financial interests in companies they regulated, governors with connections to criminal organizations, corporate executives whose business empires had been built on insider information provided by government sources in exchange for political support. Every file contained evidence that would destroy careers, collapse companies, trigger criminal investigations that would reach into the highest levels of national power. This wasn't just historical documentation. This was leverage, maintained and updated by people who understood that information was the ultimate currency in a world where official power meant less than knowing which secrets to reveal and which to protect. Someone had been using this facility not to defend the nation, but to control it, manipulating the machinery of democracy by ensuring that everyone who mattered owed their position to secrets that could be exposed or protected based on their cooperation with agendas that operated entirely outside public oversight. Sarah spent the next 3 hours exploring the facility with growing horror and unwilling fascination, discovering layer after layer of documentation that revealed patterns of manipulation stretching back 7 decades. The facility had been built during the early Cold War as a communications hub for intelligence operations, but it had evolved into something far more insidious, a repository for information that gave whoever controlled it power over the entire political and economic infrastructure of the region and potentially the nation. Surveillance had been continuous and comprehensive, targeting not just foreign threats, but anyone whose independence or integrity made them obstacles to the agendas of people who'd learned to operate in the shadows between official authority and criminal enterprise. The technology had been upgraded regularly, adapting from wiretaps and mail interception to digital surveillance and data mining that captured communications in ways most citizens would never imagine possible. The files documented hundreds of operations, journalists who'd been discredited through leaked personal information, politicians who'd been forced to resign through exposure of manufactured scandals, activists who'd been neutralized through financial pressure or blackmail. Every manipulation was documented with clinical precision, creating a historical record that proved beyond any doubt that the mechanisms of power in America bore little resemblance to the democratic processes taught in schools and celebrated in speeches. But what chilled Sarah most deeply wasn't the scope of the surveillance or the breadth of the manipulation. It was the realization that this facility wasn't unique. References throughout the files mentioned similar installations in other cities, other regions, creating a network of hidden control nodes that had been operating continuously since World War II. Project Cerberus wasn't a single facility. It was a system, designed to ensure that real power in America remained concentrated in hands that answered to no electorate, no constitution, no authority except the brutal logic of maintaining control through information that could destroy anyone who challenged the established order. And now she owned the building that housed one of its central repositories. She returned to the apartment just before dawn, exhausted and terrified in ways that had nothing to do with her previous struggles with poverty and homelessness. Those problems had been comprehensible, even if they were overwhelming. This was different. She'd stumbled into a world where her previous desperation seemed almost quaint by comparison, where the simple act of owning this property made her a threat to interests that had been killing to protect their secrets for longer than she'd been alive. Emma was still sleeping when Sarah climbed the stairs to their makeshift living quarters, and she stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a long time. Watching the rise and fall of breathing that represented innocence she could no longer protect, simply through hard work and determination. The files downstairs contained evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of government and business, but they also contained documentation of what happened to people who tried to reveal such information. Journalists found dead in apparent suicides, whistleblowers destroyed through manufactured evidence of crimes they'd never committed, ordinary citizens who'd seen too much and paid prices that ensured no one else would make the same mistake. She could walk away, take Emma and disappear, leave Grafton and the auto shop and the underground facility to whoever had been maintaining it for the past 7 decades. But even as the thought formed, Sarah knew it was a fantasy. She'd signed paperwork establishing her ownership. Government databases tracked property transfers. Whoever monitored this facility already knew the building had changed hands, and they would be coming to assess whether the new owner represented a threat that needed to be eliminated or a vulnerability that could be exploited. The first visitor arrived 3 days later, not with threats or violence, but with the professional courtesy of someone who understood that power operated most effectively through cooperation rather than confrontation. Sarah was in the garage, attempting to diagnose why the hydraulic lift in Bay 2 refused to rise higher than 4 feet, when a black sedan pulled into the lot with the kind of understated luxury that signaled government funding rather than private wealth. The man who emerged wore a suit that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in the last 6 months, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to enter any space and expect immediate deference. His credentials identified him as Robert Vance, Department of Defense, Infrastructure Security Division, though Sarah suspected the division name was deliberately vague enough to mean anything or nothing depending on circumstances. "Miss Chen, I hope I'm not interrupting," Vance said, his tone carrying the kind of warmth that made his underlying message even more threatening. "I wanted to personally welcome you to your new property and discuss some opportunities that might benefit both of us." The phrase, "both of us," was doing enormous work in that sentence, implying a partnership that Sarah had never agreed to and would never be given the option to refuse. She invited him into the office, not because she wanted the conversation, but because refusing would signal knowledge and resistance that she wasn't ready to reveal. Vance settled into the chair across from her desk with the ease of someone conducting a routine business transaction, and his opening gambit confirmed that he knew exactly what she'd discovered beneath the building. "I understand you've been exploring your new property quite thoroughly," he said, the words carrying implications that were somehow more frightening than direct threats. Frank Delaney mentioned that the new owner would likely be curious about some of the building's unusual features. "We've found that transparency, to a point, helps prevent misunderstandings that could become problematic for everyone involved." The careful phrasing was a masterclass in diplomatic intimidation. He was acknowledging the facility's existence while making clear that certain questions would not be welcomed and certain actions would trigger consequences he didn't need to specify. "I found a locked door," Sarah replied, matching his tone of professional courtesy while revealing nothing about how far her exploration had actually gone. The previous owner didn't mention anything about government facilities on the property. Vance smiled, and the expression carried approval for her careful response. "The facility beneath this building serves important national security functions that have been maintained since the early Cold War. The arrangement with previous owners has been mutually beneficial and entirely legal under authority that doesn't require disclosure during property transfers. The explanation was smooth enough to seem plausible, while being deliberately vague about what important national security functions actually meant, or which authority justified hiding government installations under. Privately owned property without the owner's knowledge or consent. What kind of arrangement? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The government maintains the facility and covers all associated costs, while the property owner provides access and discretion. In exchange, certain financial considerations are provided that help ensure the building above remains viable and doesn't attract attention from buyers who might lack the judgment necessary to understand the sensitive nature of what they've acquired. He named a figure that made Sarah's breath catch, a monthly payment that exceeded anything she could hope to earn from the auto shop, money that would solve every financial problem she'd faced and provide security for Emma that seemed impossible through any legitimate means. But the money came with obvious strings attached: silence about what she'd discovered, cooperation with people whose activities she was beginning to understand were far from the national security operations they claimed to be protecting, and complicity in a system of surveillance and manipulation that violated every principle of democratic governance she'd been taught to believe in. What happens if I refuse? The question was reckless, but Sarah had learned during her months of desperation that pretending powerlessness sometimes revealed more about the actual power dynamics than aggressive posturing. Vance's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been waiting for exactly that question. Then we'd need to discuss the various complications that could arise from having an uncooperative property owner in such a sensitive location. Building code violations that might require expensive remediation, environmental concerns that could trigger regulatory action, child protective services receiving information about unsafe living conditions. The legal system provides numerous tools for addressing situations where private interests conflict with national security requirements. Every word was carefully chosen to sound like reasonable government oversight while making absolutely clear that Emma would be used as leverage if Sarah chose resistance over cooperation. He was threatening her daughter without ever making a direct threat, relying on her desperation and fear to ensure compliance with an arrangement that had been controlling this property for 7 decades. The rage that filled Sarah in that moment was different from anything she'd felt during her previous struggles with poverty and powerlessness. Those fights had been against impersonal systems, economic forces, and bureaucratic indifference. This was personal. This was a man sitting in her office threatening to take her daughter away if she didn't cooperate with corruption that had been destroying lives since before she was born. "I need time to think about it," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fury that made her want to throw him out of the building and damn the consequences. Vance stood, apparently satisfied that he'd delivered his message and established the parameters of their relationship. "Of course, these decisions shouldn't be rushed, but I would encourage you not to delay too long. Some of my colleagues are less patient than I am, and they tend to view prolonged consideration as a sign of unreliability that requires more aggressive intervention." He left his card on her desk, heavy stock with embossed lettering and a phone number that probably connected to offices that didn't officially exist. After he'd driven away in his government sedan, Sarah sat in the office for a long time, staring at that card and thinking about the files beneath her feet, the daughter sleeping upstairs, and the impossible choice between accepting money built on corruption or fighting a system that had unlimited resources and no accountability. The auto shop around her suddenly felt less like a business opportunity and more like a trap that had been waiting decades for someone desperate enough to spring it. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah returned to the underground facility with a plan that was equal parts desperation and calculated risk. If Vance and his colleagues wanted her cooperation, they were admitting they needed the property owner's consent to continue operating, which meant she had leverage, however small, however temporary. The files she'd discovered weren't just evidence of past crimes. They were insurance, documentation that could be copied and distributed in ways that would make silencing her more dangerous than allowing her to maintain a degree of independence. She spent the next week photographing documents, copying files to encrypted drives, and creating a distribution system that would automatically release information to journalists, law enforcement, and congressional oversight committees if she failed to check in at regular intervals. It was the same strategy whistleblowers had used for years, turning information into a dead man's switch that made the source more valuable alive than dead. But she also understood that such systems only worked if the people threatening you believed you were actually willing to trigger them, which meant she would need to demonstrate a level of recklessness and conviction that could easily get her killed. The confrontation came sooner than she'd expected, triggered by her refusal to sign the cooperation agreement that Vance had delivered, with assurances that it was merely a formality to protect both parties' interests. The document was 40 pages of legal language designed to bind her to perpetual silence, while giving the government unlimited access to her property and the right to terminate the arrangement at any time based on their sole determination that she'd violated confidentiality requirements. It was a contract that would have made her a prisoner on her own property, dependent on monthly payments that could be withdrawn whenever her usefulness ended or her knowledge became too dangerous to leave unexploited. She'd refused to sign, politely at first, then with increasing firmness as the pressure escalated from subtle suggestion to explicit threat. The response had been swift and brutal in its efficiency. Building inspectors had appeared with citations for violations she knew were fabricated. Social workers had shown up asking questions about Emma's living conditions based on anonymous reports of neglect. Her business license application had been rejected for technical violations that didn't actually exist in the regulations. Every pressure point in the system that could be manipulated to force compliance was being activated simultaneously, creating a cascade of crises designed to overwhelm her resistance and make cooperation seem like the only rational response to institutional power that could destroy her through entirely legal mechanisms. But Sarah had spent the previous week preparing for exactly this escalation, and her response came not through lawyers or government appeals, but through the simultaneous release of carefully selected documents to news organizations that had previously reported on government surveillance and institutional corruption. The files she'd chosen weren't the most explosive in the facility's archives, but they were damning enough to trigger investigations and public outrage, proof that surveillance networks had been operating without congressional oversight and that information collected for national security purposes had been used for political manipulation and economic advantage. The story broke across multiple media platforms simultaneously, creating the kind of firestorm that couldn't be contained through the usual methods of official denial and bureaucratic stonewalling. Within 48 hours, congressional committees were demanding hearings, Justice Department officials were announcing investigations, and the carefully maintained secrecy that had protected Project Cerberus for 7 decades was collapsing under scrutiny that no amount of intimidation could silence. Sarah Chen, the struggling single mother who'd bought a failing auto shop for $900, had just declared war on a system that had been destroying lives since before she was born, using the only weapon available to someone with nothing left to lose. The truth, distributed widely enough that silencing her would only confirm everything she'd revealed. The federal investigation that followed Sarah's document release moved with the bureaucratic speed of institutions trying to appear responsive while actually protecting the systems they'd been designed to oversee. Congressional hearings were scheduled, then postponed. Justice Department officials gave carefully worded statements about ongoing investigations that couldn't be discussed due to national security concerns. Media coverage burned hot for 2 weeks before other scandals and crises pushed Project Cerberus from the front pages to the back sections, where stories went to be forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives they'd destroyed. But something fundamental had shifted in Sarah's situation, not because the government had suddenly become accountable or the surveillance systems had been dismantled, but because she demonstrated a willingness to destroy herself if necessary, to prevent her daughter from growing up in a world where powerful institutions could threaten children to ensure parental compliance. Robert Vance returned to the auto shop on a cold morning in late November, 6 weeks after Sarah's document release had triggered the investigations that were now disappearing into classified review processes that would never produce public accountability. He looked older than he had during his first visit, the professional polish worn down by weeks of congressional testimony and internal investigations that had apparently reached conclusions about who would be blamed for allowing the facility's secrecy to be compromised. "You've caused significant problems, Miss Chen," he said without preamble, settling into the same chair where he'd first delivered his threats with such confident authority. "People who've dedicated their careers to protecting national security are facing criminal charges. Operations that kept this country safe for decades have been exposed to hostile intelligence services. The damage you've inflicted will take years to repair, assuming it can be repaired at all." The words were meant to trigger guilt, to make her feel responsible for consequences that would be framed as endangering the nation rather than exposing the corruption that had been operating under the cover of national security. But Sarah had spent the previous 6 weeks reading more of the files in the facility beneath her building, and she'd learned exactly what operations Vance was describing as essential to national security. They were blackmail networks, systems for manipulating democratic processes, and surveillance programs that had been used to destroy anyone who challenged the concentration of power in institutions that answered to no public oversight. "Those people were destroying lives long before I exposed them," Sarah replied, her voice carrying none of the deference Vance had probably expected from someone who was technically still vulnerable to the institutional power he represented. "The files downstairs document decades of crimes committed against American citizens by the very agencies that were supposed to be protecting them. If that's what national security requires, then maybe the nation needs less security and more accountability." Vance studied her with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been reluctant respect. "You really don't understand how the world works, do you? The systems you've exposed weren't created by villains trying to undermine democracy. They were created by people who understood that real security requires making hard choices that the public is too naive or too comfortable to accept. Someone has to do the ugly work that keeps civilization functioning, even if that work can't be acknowledged or celebrated." It was the oldest justification for authoritarian power, the claim that ordinary people couldn't be trusted with the truth about their own governance, that democracy was a pleasant fiction maintained by elites who knew better than to let actual citizens make decisions about their own lives. Sarah had heard variations of this argument from every boss who'd ever demanded unquestioning obedience, every bureaucrat who'd treated her like a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving respect, every man who'd assumed that desperation meant she'd accept whatever treatment they chose to inflict. "I understand exactly how the world works," she said quietly. "People like you convince yourselves that your crimes are justified by the outcomes you're supposedly protecting. You build systems that give you power over others, and then claim that power is necessary for everyone's safety. And you destroy anyone who points out that the emperor is naked, and the security you're providing is just a euphemism for the control you're maintaining." The silence that followed her words stretched long enough that Sarah could hear traffic passing on the highway 3 blocks away, the distant sound of a world that continued turning regardless of the confrontation playing out in this failing auto shop where secrets had been hidden for 7 decades. Finally, Vance leaned forward, his expression suggesting he'd made some decision about how to proceed with a situation that had clearly moved beyond the standard protocols for managing compromised security installations. "The facility beneath this building will be decommissioned. he said, and something in his tone suggested the admission cost him more than professional pride. The official story will be that budget constraints require consolidation of redundant Cold War infrastructure. The files will be transferred to other locations where they'll be properly secured against future unauthorized disclosure. You'll be allowed to maintain ownership of the property without further interference, provided you sign agreements confirming that you've surrendered all classified materials and will face criminal prosecution if you make any additional disclosures. It was a surrender disguised as a negotiation, an acknowledgement that continued pressure on Sarah would cost more in public attention and institutional scrutiny than whatever value the facility provided. They were cutting their losses, abandoning a position that had become indefensible, and trying to salvage what remained of their operational security by removing the evidence before more journalists or investigators decided to look deeper into the story Sarah had exposed. "What about the people documented in those files?" Sarah asked, thinking of the hundreds of innocent citizens whose lives had been destroyed by surveillance and manipulation that would never be officially acknowledged or punished. "Do they get justice? Or do you just move the evidence to a new hiding place and continue operations somewhere the public won't accidentally discover them?" Vance's expression hardened. Those operations were authorized by legitimate authority and conducted within the boundaries of what was necessary for national security. No one will face prosecution for doing their jobs, regardless of how uncomfortable those jobs might seem to people who've never had to make difficult decisions about protecting an entire nation. It was the answer she'd expected, the confirmation that the system would protect itself regardless of how many lives it destroyed, that accountability was reserved for people without institutional power, while those with authority would continue operating in the shadows where democratic oversight couldn't reach them. But Sarah had learned something during her weeks of fighting an opponent that should have crushed her without effort. She'd learned that even the most powerful systems had vulnerabilities, that information distributed widely enough became impossible to suppress completely, and that ordinary people refusing to accept the world as it was presented could sometimes force changes that seemed impossible until someone was desperate or stubborn enough to try. The decommissioning process took 3 months, during which teams of workers in unmarked vehicles systematically emptied the facility beneath Sarah's auto shop, removing equipment and files with efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd been forced to abandon a compromised installation. She watched them work from the security cameras she'd installed, documenting their activities with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her previous career as a fleet maintenance supervisor. Every box they carried out was photographed, every vehicle that arrived was tracked, creating a record that would make it harder for them to claim later that materials had been properly secured when inevitably some of those files would appear in future scandals. The workers never spoke to her directly, maintaining professional distance from the property owner who'd triggered the evacuation they were conducting, but Sarah could see the resentment in their expressions, the anger of people who believed they'd been protecting the nation only to be exposed by someone too ignorant or too reckless to understand the importance of their work. She felt no sympathy for their wounded pride. These were the same people who'd threatened to take Emma away if Sarah didn't cooperate with their blackmail schemes, who'd been maintaining a surveillance infrastructure that had destroyed countless lives in service of agendas that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with maintaining power for institutions that answered to no democratic authority. By February, the facility was empty, except for the infrastructure that had been built into the building's foundation, concrete walls and ventilation systems and electrical conduits that would remain as evidence of what had been hidden there for 77 years. The workers sealed the entrance with concrete, eliminating the stairway that had led to discoveries Sarah still struggled to fully comprehend, leaving her with an auto shop that had slightly less usable square footage than its exterior dimensions suggested, and a story that no one outside classified briefing rooms would ever believe without evidence she'd already distributed. too widely to be completely suppressed. The monthly payments Vance had originally offered never materialized, unsurprisingly, but the auto shop itself began generating modest income as word spread through Grafton's industrial community that the new owner was competent, honest, and charged fair prices for work that was actually completed correctly. Sarah had learned during her years in fleet maintenance that most people didn't need the cheapest service or the fanciest facility. They needed someone who would diagnose problems accurately, fix them properly, and treat customers with the respect that corporate chain shops rarely provided. The skills she'd developed, managing complex logistics and coordinating multiple contractors, translated surprisingly well to running a small business, and within 6 months the shop was profitable enough to cover their basic expenses while slowly building reserves that would eventually allow for proper repairs to the building and maybe even expansion into the bays that had been unusable. When she'd first arrived, Emma adjusted to their new life with the resilience that children demonstrated when their parents provided stability and honest explanations about why their circumstances had changed. She'd made friends at the local school, developed a fascination with how engines worked, and spent her afternoons in the shop helping Sarah organize parts and learning the basics of automotive repair with the focused attention of a child who'd learned that understanding how systems functioned gave you power over situations that seemed overwhelming to people who only saw problems without comprehending solutions. On quiet evenings when the shop was closed and Emma was asleep upstairs in the apartment that now had proper heat and windows that actually sealed against winter cold, Sarah would sometimes stand in the garage and think about the facility that had been hidden beneath her feet, the files that documented 70 years of crimes committed in the name of national security, and the people whose lives had been destroyed by systems that operated in darkness because sunlight would have revealed their true nature. She'd kept copies of the most damaging files, encrypted and distributed to locations that would ensure their release if anything happened to her. Insurance against the possibility that Vance or his colleagues might decide that eliminating her was worth the risk of additional exposure. But she suspected they'd concluded that leaving her alone was safer than creating a martyr whose death would trigger investigations they'd worked so hard to contain. The journalists who'd initially covered her story moved on to other scandals, as journalists always did, but a few maintained contact, calling periodically to ask whether she'd discovered additional information or experienced any retaliation from the agencies she'd exposed. Sarah answered their questions honestly but without the drama they seemed to want, explaining that life had returned to something resembling normal, that she was running an auto shop and raising her daughter and trying to build a future that didn't involve government facilities or classified documents or confrontations with people who measured power in their ability to destroy lives without facing consequences. One journalist, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd written extensively about government surveillance programs, visited the shop in early spring to interview Sarah for a longer feature about what had happened to the people who'd exposed Project Cerberus after the media attention faded and the public moved on to newer outrages. They sat in the office where Vance had first delivered his threats, drinking coffee that Sarah had learned to make properly after months of serving customers who appreciated small courtesies along with competent repairs, and talked about what it meant to fight systems that were designed to outlast any individual's resistance. "Do you regret exposing the facility?" Patricia asked, her recorder sitting between them on the desk, capturing a conversation that would be edited into an article most people would never read because stories about institutional corruption rarely competed successfully with celebrity gossip and political theater. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had happened since she'd signed the paperwork, making her the owner of a building she'd bought for $900 because she'd had no other options left. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that the systems supposed to protect us had become tools for controlling us. I regret that people dedicated their careers to surveillance and manipulation instead of actual public service. But I don't regret exposing it, even though I know most of the people responsible will never face real consequences, and the operations will probably just move somewhere else and continue under different names. Patricia nodded, apparently unsurprised by an answer that acknowledged reality without retreating into cynicism or despair. What about your daughter? Do you worry about what growing up with this history will do to her understanding of how government and power work? It was a question Sarah thought about frequently, watching Emma develop her own sense of how the world functioned and what responsibilities came with knowledge that most people preferred to avoid. I think she's learning that telling the truth is dangerous but necessary, Sarah replied. That powerful institutions will always try to protect themselves rather than serve the people they're supposed to help. And that ordinary people can sometimes force changes just by refusing to accept the world as it's presented to them, even when fighting back seems impossible. The interview was published in a magazine that specialized in investigative journalism, reaching an audience of people who already believed that government surveillance was excessive and institutional accountability was inadequate. It changed nothing about the systems Sarah had exposed, generated no new investigations or reforms, and disappeared into the endless stream of content that characterized modern media consumption. But she kept a copy of the article in her desk drawer, along with the sales agreement for the auto shop and the first positive bank statement showing that her business was profitable, evidence that her desperate gamble had produced something more valuable than the financial security she'd been seeking when she'd signed paperwork, making her the owner of a building that held secrets she'd never asked to discover. The seasons turned with the reliable rhythm that characterized life in places where people actually noticed weather and landscape, where spring meant customers needed air conditioning repairs and winter meant battery replacements and heating system diagnostics. The auto shop became part of Grafton's industrial landscape, unremarkable except to the people who relied on it for services they needed and appreciated the owner who treated them with respect that corporate chains rarely provided. Emma turned 9, then 10, growing into a child who understood more about how power operated than most adults would ever comprehend, who'd watched her mother fight institutions that should have destroyed them both, and learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being terrified of the consequences. She helped in the shop after school, learning skills that would serve her regardless of what career she eventually chose, understanding that knowing how systems functioned gave you advantages over people who only saw surfaces without comprehending the mechanisms underneath. Sarah never told her daughter the full details of what had been hidden in the facility beneath their building, believing that some knowledge was too heavy for children to carry. But Emma understood enough to know that her mother had fought people who threatened their family and won something that looked like victory, even if the underlying systems remained largely unchanged. On the second anniversary of buying the auto shop, Sarah stood in the garage bay, where she'd first discovered the hidden door that had led to everything that followed. Looking at the concrete that now sealed the entrance to a facility that had been emptied and officially decommissioned, but probably reconstituted somewhere else under different names with similar purposes. The building around her had been transformed through 2 years of steady work, repairs that she'd completed herself using skills developed through years in construction management and fleet maintenance, turning a failing business into something sustainable that provided both income and dignity. The apartment upstairs was properly winterized now, with functioning heat and windows that sealed, and a kitchen that consisted of more than a hot plate and a mini fridge. Emma had her own room, decorated with posters and school projects, and the accumulating evidence of a childhood that was stable enough to allow for interests beyond simple survival. It wasn't the life Sarah had imagined when she'd been working as a fleet maintenance supervisor, earning a salary that had seemed comfortable until it disappeared and revealed how precarious middle-class security actually was for people without wealth or connections to cushion them against economic disruption. But it was a life she'd built through determination and desperation and a willingness to fight when fighting seemed like the only alternative to accepting defeat. The land beneath her feet held secrets that would never be fully revealed, crimes that would never be properly punished, and systems that would continue operating regardless of how many people like her managed to expose their true nature. But it also held her future and Emma's future, built on ownership that couldn't be taken away by corporate downsizing or economic recession or landlords who preferred tenants with steady incomes. Patricia Reeves called one final time, 3 years after their interview, to inform Sarah that she was writing a book about Project Cerberus and the network of surveillance facilities that had been operating throughout the Cold War and into the present era. She wanted to include Sarah's story as a case study in how ordinary citizens sometimes stumbled into discovering institutional corruption and what happened to them when they chose exposure over cooperation. "Will it make any difference?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Systems that had survived for 7 decades wouldn't be dismantled by a book that most people would never read. And the people responsible for operating those systems had already demonstrated their ability to weather public scrutiny without facing real accountability. Probably not in the short term, Patricia admitted with the honesty of someone who'd spent her career documenting corruption that rarely produced the reforms she hoped to inspire. But information compounds. Every person who understands how these systems work becomes slightly harder to manipulate. Every exposure makes the next exposure more credible. Maybe in 20 years or 50 years, enough people will understand what's been done in their name that democratic oversight might actually mean something. Or maybe not. But at least we'll have created a record that can't be completely erased. Sarah gave her permission to use the story, knowing that her name would be attached to a history that would follow Emma through her life, marking them both as people who challenged authority and survived when most people in similar situations had been destroyed or silenced. It was a legacy she would have preferred to avoid, but refusing to be documented wouldn't change what had happened or protect them from people who already knew their names and what they'd exposed. The book was published to respectful reviews in outlets that covered institutional corruption, sold modestly to audiences predisposed to believe that government surveillance was excessive, and changed nothing about the systems it documented. Sarah bought a copy and placed it on the shelf in their apartment, next to Emma's school books and the repair manuals for vehicles they serviced in the shop, evidence of a battle that had been fought and nominally won, even though the war continued in forms that most people never recognized or acknowledged. On quiet nights when the shop was closed and Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table they'd bought from a second-hand store and refinished together, Sarah would sometimes think about the files that had been removed from the facility beneath their building, wondering where they'd been taken and whether the surveillance they documented was continuing under new protocols with improved security against future exposure. She'd learned enough about institutional power to understand that exposing one facility hadn't dismantled the systems it represented, that the people who operated those systems had resources and determination that outlasted any individual's resistance, and that victory for people like her was measured not in systemic change but in survival and small zones of independence carved from a landscape designed to eliminate anyone who challenged established authority. But she'd also learned that fighting back was possible even when success seemed impossible, that information distributed widely enough became harder to suppress than people like Vance understood, and that ordinary citizens refusing to cooperate with their own exploitation could sometimes force powerful institutions to abandon positions they'd maintained for decades. The auto shop hummed with the ordinary sounds of commerce and repair, air compressors and impact wrenches, and the steady rhythm of work that people needed and were willing to pay for when it was done competently and honestly. Emma grew up understanding that her mother had fought people who threatened their family and established something solid enough to build a future on, not through wealth or political connections, but through skills and stubbornness and a willingness to risk everything rather than accept that powerful institutions could threaten children to ensure parental compliance. The land itself, that industrial lot in Grafton where secrets had been hidden for 77 years, had given back something Sarah had never expected to find when she'd signed paperwork, making her the owner of a failing business she'd bought because she'd had no other options left. It had given her agency in a world designed to eliminate it, knowledge that powerful institutions preferred to keep hidden, and a demonstration that ordinary people could sometimes challenge systems that seemed too powerful to resist. The concrete sealing the facility's entrance would eventually crack and deteriorate. Future owners would discover evidence of what had been hidden there, and maybe they would ask questions that would lead to new exposures and new accountability. Or maybe they would accept official explanations and move on without recognizing the history beneath their feet. Either way, Sarah Chen had done what Augustus Brennan and Frank Delaney had tried to do in their own generations. She'd exposed truth that powerful interests wanted suppressed, survived the retaliation that typically destroyed people who made such exposures, and created something lasting from a desperate gamble that had seemed like her last chance at building a future worth living. The struggling single mother who'd bought a failing auto shop for $900 had become the guardian of a legacy that would outlast the systems it had challenged, proof that sometimes the most important victories weren't measured in reforms or prosecutions, but in the simple fact of survival and the knowledge passed to the next generation that fighting back was possible, even when the odds seemed overwhelming and the enemies seemed invincible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.